Hey there, team. Today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. We're actually going to be covering the history of the trolls of the Warcraft universe today. Out of all the species of Azeroth, the trolls are some of, if not the most, unique and diverse in the entire series, having a bunch of cultures, clans, and empires that spanned across the entire continent. Trolls have been around the Warcraft series since the second installment, and they've been in the lore since the very beginning. This video will cover all the lore of the trolls pre-Mists of Pandaria, which means we're going to be going over the origins of the trolls, their empires, their wars, the stories of those who joined the Horde, the stories of those who didn't, and a whole lot more. Think of this as kind of a bridge between the Cataclysm expansion and the Mists of Pandaria expansion. With all that, stretch your back, roll your shoulders, and squat down into a comfortable position, because this is all the lore you need to know about the trolls of Warcraft. Up to Mists of Pandaria. The trolls have been around for longer than any playable race in World of Warcraft. They are beings that are as tall as Tauren, as agile as elves, as strong as orcs, and are extremely proficient in magic. The trolls were some of the earliest sentient life that existed on Azeroth. They've basically been around for forever. The trolls started out living around the Well of Eternity before slowly migrating down towards southern Kalimdor, the land now known as Zandalari, which was the resting place of many of the wild gods. See, the trolls worshipped a lot of the wild gods who they called the Loa. The Loa are of the same type of being as the Guardians of Ashenvale and the Emerald Dream, but they are also a little different. Loa gain power through worship, and they also control certain realms and magic that are different from the nature magic controlled by the wild gods of Ashenvale. The trolls originally were all of one kind and unified as one tribe, a tribe that would evolve over time into an empire, the Zandalari Empire, and that was populous and powerful. Even though they were the only troll empire around, they weren't the only major power growing in old Azeroth. A race of Titan-forged warriors known as the Mogu had created their own empire in the Vale of Eternal Blossoms. The Zandalari and the Mogu Empire formed an alliance, both believing that the other wouldn't dare betray them, since they both thought themselves more powerful than the other. However, the Mogu Emperor Lei Shen would lead his army along with some Zandalari allies into the land of Uldum. There, Lei Shen would meet his end at the hands of a Titan weapon, and the Mogu Empire would never flourish to the same strength again. The Mogu Empire would collapse on itself, being capped off by the Pandaren Revolution. But before the Mogu fell, they had promised land to the Zandalari, and the Pandaren had no intention of honoring that agreement made between their former masters and the trolls. So a Zandalari invasion force was sent to conquer the new Pandaren land, led by a warrior named Mengazi. During the war between the Zandalari and the Pandaren, a young Pandaren named Jiang was able to tame cloud serpents and use them against the invading trolls. Eventually, Mengazi planned to resurrect the dead Lei Shen and bring the Mogu back as allies, but Jiang sacrificed herself to kill Mengazi, stopping the ritual and causing the trolls to retreat back to their own land. The Zandalari were divided by a caste system, and over time, those who were considered of a lower caste would leave Zandalar, venturing off to different corners of Kalimdor. The higher-ups of the Zandalari caste scoffed at the trolls who were foolish enough to leave their empire, and they expected the lower castes to come crawling back. Instead, those lower castes formed their own thriving tribes, the Amani, the Drakkari, and the Gurubashi. Later on, a group of Gurubashi witch doctors that had been exiled from their tribe ended up finding the resting place of Kithix, an incredibly powerful warlord of the old gods. Kithix was awoken by the exiled witch doctors, and after slaughtering his summoners, he called forth the old god forces that lay dormant in the earth and began a war against the Zandalari trolls. The Zandalari trolls held off the armies of Kithix for a while, but they were greatly outnumbered and soon to be overwhelmed. Zandalar reached out to the tribes who had left and pleaded for an alliance to save not just Zandalar, but all of troll kind. The other tribes agreed, and the Empire of Zul was formed. The united troll forces pushed back the old god's assault and continued to do so over the course of thousands of years until the insectoid armies of the old gods split in two. One section headed to the deserts in the south, and the other section headed to the wastelands in the north. And even their leader, Kithix, was gravely wounded by the trolls Loa and had retreated to the northeast. The troll tribes ventured out to slay the retreating forces of the old gods, with the Gurubashi beating back the Aqir and conquering the south, the Drakkari beating back the Aqir and taking control of the north, and the Amani hunting down and slaying Kithix and taking control of the northeast. Eventually, the unity of the tribes faded as they became more detached from the Empire of Zul and became their own empires over time. Now, there was a group of trolls that did not participate in the Empire of Zul, and they were a group of dark trolls who had left Zandalar long ago, but did not respond to the call to fight Kithix and his Aqir. This group of dark trolls lived along the coasts of the Well of Eternity, and over time they were heavily affected by the well's magical powers. These trolls would come to worship the moon goddess Elune and the wild gods of Hyjal instead of the Loa of Zandalar, and ultimately, those trolls would evolve into the Kaldorei, or as we call them, the Night Elves. The Kaldorei and their empire grew over time, and soon they began warring with the trolls. While the trolls had numbers, the Kaldorei had incredibly powerful magic thanks to the Well of Eternity, and they were able to quickly push the trolls out of their territory. The Troll Empires and the Kaldorei Empire eventually came to a non-aggression pact. The trolls were no match for the magic of the Night Elves, and the elves had already conquered so much of Kalimdor and greatly reduced the Troll Empires in size that the trolls had no choice but to agree to the Night Elves' demands. And because of this, the trolls of Azeroth would never really forget and never really forgive the Kaldorei. So when the Night Elves' reckless use of magic eventually drew the Burning Legion to Azeroth, the trolls did not send aid to fight against the demons during the War of the Ancients. And when the War of the Ancients ended, the Kaldorei Empire was in shambles and Kalimdor was sundered into different continents, completely dividing the troll empires throughout the world. The Drakkari lived in Zul'Drak on the northern continent of Northrend, the Amani lived in Zul'Aman in the northern part of the eastern continent of Azeroth, and the Gurubashi lived in the southern part of Azeroth in Zul'Gurub. The former Gurubashi, now separated by the Sundering, calling themselves the Sand Furies, lived in Zul'Furrak in the southern part of the western continent of Kalimdor, and the land of Zandalar was shattered into an island completely cut off from the rest of the world, and that is where the Zandalari have remained till this very day. After the War of the Ancients, there were Night Elves who still wanted to use the arcane magic of the Well of Eternity, and had no interest in using the druidic magic being taught by Malfurion Stormrage. These Night Elves were called the Highborn, and the Highborn ended up being banished from Night Elf lands, and they set sail to the eastern continent, landing in Tirisfal Glades. The Highborn would engage with the earliest of human tribes and also skirmish with the Amani trolls, whose empire the Highborn were now invading. Eventually, the Highborn would make their way to what is now called Quel'Thalas, and by this point they had completely changed in form, from Night Elf to High Elf. And this is when the Amani would begin their seemingly never-ending war against the High Elves. It was around 4,000 years after the founding of Quel'Thalas that the Amani trolls were strong enough and vast enough to start pushing back the High Elves and their magic. While the elves did have their powerful sorcery, the trolls had endless numbers and an endless bloodlust. Eventually, the High Elves were battered back so far that they were close to falling to the Amani. The elves even sent out for aid from their newly established human kingdom of Arathor. The humans agreed to help so long as the elves were willing to teach the humans some of their magic. Eventually, the Arathi humans joined the High Elves in their war against the Amani, but unfortunately, the alliance of men and elves was pushed back to the human fort in the Zul'Drak Mountains. There, in the mountains, the elven and newly taught human mages unleashed a massive firestorm on the troll army, decimating the Amani forces to the point that they had to retreat from Zul'Drak to Zul'Aman, and eventually retreat from the war. And with their utter defeat at the hands of the human and elf alliance, the forest trolls would never truly rise to that same level of might ever again. The troll empires began to wither. Over thousands of years of fighting Aqir, then night elves, then high elves, then humans, and then fighting themselves, the trolls no longer held the same imposing grip on the world as they once did in millennia past. Now disease, famine, and forces they couldn't physically fight back against began to plague the Gurubashi Empire of Stranglethorn. In their dire need, the Gurubashi sought out aid from their Loa, and the one who responded was Hakkar, the Loa of Blood. Hakkar was a powerful god, and he demanded daily sacrifices, with his final goal having him being summoned into the realm of Azeroth. It didn't take long for the Gurubashi to realize that they were killing a lot of their own citizens in the name of Hakkar, and many tribes in the Gurubashi Empire began to stir with the thought of rebellion against Hakkar and his loyal priests, the Zandalari. The Zandalari trolls kept tabs on the growing empire of the Gurubashi, and they were happy to see their fellow trolls begin to thrive once again. However, the Zandalari soon realized that Hakkar, the Soul Flayer, was behind the recent rise of Gurubashi power. Many trolls of Zandalari headed out to Stranglethorn and warned their kinsmen of the dangers of Hakkar and the threat the Loa of Blood posed to the world. With that, most of the Gurubashi tribes, along with some of the Zandalari, revolted against Hakkar and his blood priests, eventually killing Hakkar's avatar and banishing any surviving Zandalari priests to the swamplands north of Zul'Gurub. The Gurubashi Empire fell after the defeat of Hakkar, with the remaining tribes splitting off into parts of the jungle and islands off the coast. While the Zandalari were able to construct the temple in the Swamp of Sorrows, in the Temple of Hakkar, the Zandalari tried to summon the Loa of Blood back into Azeroth again. But this time, they were ultimately stopped by the aspect of the green dragonflight, Ysera. Ysera and her dragons destroyed the temple and sank it to the bottom of the Swamp of Sorrows, where it would remain dormant for over 1,000 years. We're getting closer to modern times now. During Warcraft 2, the Orcish Horde had pushed their way up the eastern continent and ended up in the land of Lordaeron and the Eastern Kingdoms. It was while the Orcs were fighting the High Elves in the Human Alliance that the Amani trolls took notice of the conflict. Zul'jin, the leader and great hero of the Amani trolls, had rallied together most of the forest troll tribes, and with them, joined the Horde. The Horde had fought their way up to Quel'Tha Lost, where they then began a siege on the High Elf Kingdom. Unfortunately for the Horde, the Human Alliance had shown up and pushed the Horde back. War Chief of the Orcish Horde, Orgrim Doomhammer, decided that tactically it would be better to give up on Quel'Tha Lost for the time being, and to attack the more vulnerable human kingdom of Lordaeron instead. Zul'jin outright refused to give up his chance to take out the High Elves, and he, along with most of the forest trolls, left the Horde, choosing to stay behind in Quel'Tha Lost. The Amani trolls were then pushed farther and farther away from elf-controlled lands. Zul'jin was eventually captured and tortured by elven rangers, and a small Amani warband attacked the ranger outpost, which distracted the elves long enough for Zul'jin to escape, although at the cost of his arm and eye. The forest trolls who weren't still fighting alongside the Horde retreated deep into the woods and mountains, and most of the Amani had holed themselves up inside Zul'Aman, completely defeated. The Horde was eventually defeated and the Orcs were imprisoned by the Alliance for a decade or two, after which they were liberated by the new Orc warchief Thrall. Thrall and his new Horde would leave the human-filled lands of the Eastern Kingdoms and set off for Kalimdor. On their way to the new continent, they ran into an island full of Darkspear trolls who gladly joined the Horde after the Orcs saved them from their enemies attacking their home. The Darkspear, led by Vol'jin, would fight alongside the Orcs as they made their home in Kalimdor. In fact, Durotar and Orgrimmar, as well as most land in Kalimdor claimed by the Horde, was equally earned by the blood of the Darkspear trolls, as well as the Orcs. The Darkspear, who once belonged to the Gurubashi Empire, had become loyal members of Thrall's Horde, and they would stand with the Horde over any troll empire until the end. Tanaris was once a lush jungle, but after the Sundering it turned into a vast desert. The former jungle trolls who lived there became sand trolls, and unfortunately the lands they once controlled were covered by sand over time. The now called Sand Fury Trolls' only real piece of land left is their capital of Zul'Furrak. Or I guess I should say that Zul'Furrak was the only piece of land left. By the end of classic World of Warcraft, the Sand Troll city had been raided and ransacked, and all the trolls within were eliminated by treasure hunters and adventurers. And now I covered what happened in Zul'Gurub in more detail in my classic WoW lore video, but real quick, the Atal'ai were able to successfully summon Hakkar the Soul Flayer into Azeroth, and the Blood Loa took control over Zul'Gurub. The Zandalari, along with the Darkspear trolls, called for aid from the Horde and the Alliance, and they were able to invade Zul'Gurub and kill Hakkar, and crumble the Gurubashi Empire in the process. And up in the north, Zul'jin had started to rebuild the Amani army and used dark powers to help him do so. The Amani were able to capture the spirits of some of their powerful Loa and use them to increase the strength and abilities of some of their greatest warriors. With the Dark Portal open, and the Horde and Alliance mainly focused on dealing with Illidan and the Burning Legion, Zul'jin and the Amani ventured out of Zul'Aman to take the High Elves by surprise. Unfortunately for the trolls, the High Elves were now the Blood Elves, and the Blood Elves were allies of the new Horde, which was something that really pissed off Zul'jin. While attempting to raid the lands of Quel'Tha Lost, the Amani were pushed back by the Blood Elves and their new allies. Eventually, champions of Azeroth, spearheaded by the Blood Elves, ventured into Zul'Aman to stop the Amani warbands and to kill Zul'jin for good. Afterwards, the Amani fell silent again. Without their hero warlord alive to unite them, the survivors succumbed to infighting. And just like with Zul'Gurub, I covered what happened to Zul'Drak in a previous video, but just to quickly recap, the Ice Trolls of Northrend lived in their massive capital of Zul'Drak. However, they shared their continent of Northrend with the Lich King and his undead armies. It didn't take long for the Drakkari trolls of Zul'Drak to start losing their war against the endless legions of the Undead Scourge. In their desperation, the Drakkari imprisoned and then in some cases murdered and ate their own Loas in order to become strong enough to push back against the undead. In the end, it was all in vain, with several leaders of the Drakkari aggressively pushing against enemies of the Lich King, like the Argent Crusade and the Knights of the Ebon Blade, which caused the Champions of the Light to clear out most of the warriors of Zul'Drak, and the Scourge eventually consumed whatever remained. And finally, after Deathwing caused the Cataclysm, but before the Hour of Twilight was stopped, the Trolls of Zandalar ventured out to the lands of Azeroth to recruit any and all surviving troll nations to a specific cause. This cause was led by Zul the Prophet, and the Zandalari reached out to the survivors of the Gurubashi and Amani empires in an attempt to reform the Empire of Zul. In Zul'Gurub, the Gurubashi trolls rallied with the aid of the Zandalari, and they were able to harness the power of the Loa once again. Jindo the Hexer had captured the spirit of Hakkar and was channeling the Loa's essence in order to power his tribe. The Gurubashi trolls then launched a massive wave of assaults throughout all of Stranglethorn Vale. Only Vol'jin and his Darkspear tribe remained loyal to the Horde, and they were able to push back against the Gurubashi, eventually infiltrating the city of Zul'Gurub. There, the Darkspear led a combined offense of Horde and Alliance in slaying the Zandalari High Priests and Gurubashi warlords that lay inside, ending with the defeat of Jin'do, who was murdered at the hands of Hakkar. And while the Loa of Blood wasn't unleashed into the realm of Azeroth, it wasn't destroyed either. But the Gurubashi and its followers throughout Stranglethorn were finally dealt with for the last time. The Amani were lost without Zul'jin, but during his brief absence, the warrior Drakkari took over as the new warlord. With the aid of the Zandalari, Drakkari was able to remake some of the Amani forces, but even the aid of the Zandalari wasn't going to be enough. The Blood Elves, now able to be fully focused on dealing with their neighboring troll threat, sent their best soldiers, the Farstrider Rangers, to deal with the Amani. The Farstriders were joined by the High Elven Rangers of Dalaran and by the Darkspear Trolls, personally led by Vol'jin himself. Vol'jin and the elite warriors that followed him stormed the gates of Zul'Aman and were able to vanquish all of the Amani that were inside, putting an end to the Amani Empire for good, and putting a stop to the Zandalari Trolls' quest for conquest. Or so he thought. But the Prophet Zul had one last plan. He sent his troops to a far-off land where the Zandalari Trolls would bring back to life a monstrous thing. The ancient ally of the Zandalar, who we'll cover next time in Mists of Pandaria. And that about does it, so I'll say the stuff. Some things here I skipped, and some things there I cut. But all in all, in this picture show was all the troll lore you needed to know. Thanks for watching, our subs near 1,000. Be sure to come back for the next WoW expansion. Until then, subscribe and that bell you should ring, because next time we'll cover the Thunder King.